Welcome to a Moscow special, where history, steel, and strategy meet. Long after colonial rule ended, India found a new partner in the Soviet Union. Together, they built not just steel plants and military strength, but a foundation for India's future. Post-independence, India looked east, not the west, but to the USSR to build its industries and defense. This is a story of friendship, strategy, and steel. He is here in Russia, peeling back the curtain on a partnership that built a nation. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, welcome to Moscow.
Very good to be here, though I must say I could use some better weather.
I would disagree with that. Now, Tolstoy exchanges with Gandhi USSR support during Goa's liberation and then the 1971 veto. Does all this indicate a deeper friendship between India and Russia? And does that go beyond just a diplomatic understanding?
Yeah, I think that there's been a lot of connections. You're right to mention Gandhi's letter to Tolstoy. In fact, Tolstoy first wrote to somebody else, a man called Taraknath Das, who was a revolutionary, who was in North America, in Canada and Seattle and so on. And he wrote it was called Letter to a Hindu. And then Gandhiji came across a copy of that letter, wanted to publish it in his magazine, got Tolstoy's permission, and then got into an exchange with Tolstoy. And what was interesting was Tolstoy was increasingly convinced that resistance to oppression, especially colonial oppression, was justified, but that violence was the wrong way to go about it, and that he talked about the language of love. And in many ways, Gandhiji, who was thinking about ahimsa, satyagraha, peaceful resistance, found a lot of resonance there. And then they had a correspondence, Tolstoy and Gandhi. So all of these things put together will be the first major exposure. But in fact, you could actually say a few hundred years earlier, there was a Russian traveler called Alexei Nikitin, I think, who came to India during the days of the Mughals and wrote about India. So Russians had heard about India already. And even in the 19th century, there was a bit of a great game between the Russian Empire and the British Empire for contest over Central Asia. Afghanistan was really caught up in that much more than India was. But the Great Game was, again, part of the problem. It's even said that the British ambassador in St. Petersburg was once responsible for an assassination of a Tsar at that time because they were worried about Russian designs on India. So that Russia was not unconscious of India, and India was not unconscious of Russia, but the 20th century consciousness was a bit special. Jawaharlal Nehru, as a young idealistic Congress leader, went with his father to the Soviet Union in the late 1920s and wrote a book about it. He was absolutely captivated by this new experiment. Nehruji had already been influenced by British socialist ideas, so-called Fabian socialism, and he sort of saw the Soviet Union as the country that was creating socialism on the ground, and he was very, very positive. Then you ended up with other Congress Party resolutions talking about a socialist pattern of society, and all of that showed some affinity to Russia and the Soviet Union, which was already, in any case, sympathetic to liberation movements around the world, not just India's, but again, for ideological reasons, the Soviet movement was in favor of liberation. There was a brief period when the British and the Soviets were in alliance during the Second World War, and at that time, they backed off from the nationalist movement. But again, after independence, friendship again came. Mr. Khrushchev, in particular, opened up Indo-Soviet relations phenomenally. He not only permitted a great deal of warmth in the diplomatic relationship, but he helped India in everything from setting up the Bhilai steel plant to the whole business of cooperating with India's space programs. All sorts of things happened. And then after the war with China in 1962, India needed weapons that the Western was not prepared to sell, and the Russians were willing to do that. So you found a warming. So by the time you mentioned 1971, there was already now a couple of decades of much closer relationship, military supplies, technological assistance, industrial assistance. And then 71 was a very serious moment for India. We had 10 million refugees from East Pakistan. The Pakistanis were very hostile, had no desire to take these people back. The Americans were supporting Pakistan because Pakistan was the base through which the Americans were reaching out to China. There was then a letter exchange between the Pakistanis and the Chinese saying if there was any war with India, that China would be sympathetic to Pakistan. And at that point, Indira Gandhi, the Indian Prime Minister, decided to conclude a treaty of friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union. So 71 then marked really a sign. It was a warning to the Chinese as well. If you start intervening in this war in favor of Pakistan, the Soviet Union might intervene in our favor. In the end, nobody needed to intervene because Indian soldiers fought a very decisive lightning campaign, and in a matter of 17 days, they captured the whole of East Pakistan. The Pakistani army surrendered, and victory was ours. Bangladesh was born. But all of this whole period, showed the Soviet Union as a very important, reliable, and trusted friend of India's. So I would say you're right. It goes back a long way throughout the 20th century. It covers a lot of ground. We haven't even talked about the influence of Soviet literature, which was also very important. A lot of Russian novels, classic as well as pre-communist era as well as later, were read in India in translation. I've had young people, even in Kerala, my state, talking about growing up with a magazine called Misha, which was a Soviet magazine published for Malayali children in Malayalam, and similarly in Hindi, in Bengali, in other languages. So the Soviet Union did a terrific job of getting into the consciousness of Indians. A lot of student exchange programs were there. I know many, many Indians who went off to the Soviet Union as students, received Soviets. Just yesterday in Moscow, I met an Indian who had gone on a student exchange program and who had received in India a Russian student as an exchange student, and he married her. And there you are. Now he has been settled in Moscow for 35 years. So these connections, human connections, are also very important.
From Bhagat Singh to Savarkar to Nehru, Indian freedom fighters and Indian leaders, they've drawn inspiration from Russian thinkers, from, Russian movements as well. Why do you think India never adopted the communist model after independence?
Well, because India was also at the same time very profoundly convinced of the values of democracy, constitutionalism, liberal pluralism, and there were many good reasons for that. At the most basic level, ours is such a big, diverse society that there was a perception that it could only be managed by a democratic system of governance that would give everybody an opportunity to have a stake in the society and be heard. Secondly, there is the undoubted fact that when you've been ruled for 200 years by people who are denying you democracy, who are denying you freedom of speech, who are denying you fundamental rights, then you want it all the more. You crave it. If the British won't give it to us, it must be worth having. So we were very keen on having the kind of systems that the British were excluding us from. And that too was a factor. A third thing was that I think a lot of the Indian nationalist thinking evolved through an exposure to the Western Enlightenment. In other words, you had liberalism as a factor that infected the minds of the Indian nationalists. And in the 19th century, for example, the classic title of Dadabhai Naoroji's first book about the drain theory was Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. So he was accusing the British of being un-British in India by the way they were treating Indians. In other words, the whole idea was the British were the gold standard. We want to be like that, but you are not treating us the way you should be behaving. That kind of argument. In fact, Dadabhai Naoroji was the first Indian to be elected to the British Parliament, and other Indians tried to do the same thing. So I would say that we wanted to be part of that system. But within that system, as you know, there were various political currents, and socialism and communism within liberal constitutionalism was available. For example, the Fabian Society, Sidney and Beatrice Webb in England in the 1920s. If you look at Harold Lasky at the London School of Economics, there were a lot of people whose economics were left of center, which was similar in many ways to the communist understanding of economic inequality, the injustices of capitalism, and so on. But rather than imposing the dictatorship of the proletariat, they wanted to achieve greater equality and socialism through democracy. And I think Indians, people like Nehru, Ram Manohar Lohia, Jayaprakash Narayan, the socialist thinkers in India came from that school of thought. They wanted democracy, constitutionalism. They liked the British system that way, but they wanted it infused with a strong sense of social justice, a reduction of inequality, and so on.
How crucial was Russia's support in India's early decades? And has any other country come close to the scale of involvement that we're talking about?
No, the Soviet support was very important. In the early days, as you said, well, not the earliest days, but I would say the turning point would be 54, 55. You saw the passing away of Stalin, who had various reasons had been fairly suspicious, I think, of the bourgeois revolution in India. The Communist Party itself, under Soviet direction, was not friendly to the Congress government, and the Congress was not friendly to the communists. But in 54, 55, you had the arrival in Moscow of Khrushchev and Bulgarin, and they had a very different approach. Khrushchev, in particular, warmed to India. He was already beginning to liberalize. De-Stalinization was the move. And at that time, opening up to India became a very positive approach. So the idea was, let us be friendly to India, even though they are not communist. And at the same time, let us help India to develop, through its 5-year plans, the state sector of the economy. So the first major integrated steel plant in India, Bhilai, was set up in 1955 by the Soviet Union. There was another plant that took some years to build in the 1960s in Bokaro. So these were important contributions to India's industrialization. Whereas when India turned to the US and said, can you help us acquire a steel industry? The feeling in the US was, why should we help the Indian government to build socialism in India? We are a capitalist society. Let them buy our steel, but we won't help them become a socialist power. The second major move, as I mentioned to you when we talked earlier about the history, was the support for India's space program. The Russians were very helpful at every stage in doing that. The third was the defense industry. And I would say that they were willing to sell us weapons that the West was not willing to sell. But even more important, they were willing to transfer technology. So, for example, as early as 1962, the Soviet MiG-21, the Soviets agreed to license its manufacture in India. So the MiG-21 was being made in India with Soviet technology, but manufactured in India. So you saw some of these things, and I think at one point, the reliance on the Soviet Union for weaponry was so high that 70% of India's defense imports were coming from the Soviet Union. And if you count spares and everything else, it might be even higher. I've even read figures going up to 86%. So it's a very, very heavy military dependence. So I would say all of these things were very important.
But Shashi, were Soviet exports really substandard, or was that just misinformation?
Well, there's a debate about that, because in some of the other developing countries, there was an argument that the Soviets were selling inferior versions of their goods. That to begin with, the argument was that the Soviet versions were not as good as the Western ones, but that what they were giving abroad was even cheaper than what was done for the Soviets consumer in the Soviet Union. But I don't think that India suffered from that. Certainly the MiG-21, the Soviets transferred their current technology of that time to us, similar to the steel plants. I don't think anyone can claim it was inferior. In space technology, things got a bit challenging later. At the beginning, the Soviets helped us. For example, our very first satellite, Aryabhatta, was launched from a Soviet station. Then the Soviets helped us with our first 2 Earth satellites, Bhaskara 1 and Bhaskara 2, which were very important for us for meteorology, studying weather patterns of India. You know how dependent we are on the monsoons for our rains, for agriculture, and those are very useful. So these were all state of the art. I mean, you don't send an inferior satellite up in the air. But I do want to stress that there were collaborative efforts. Indian scientists, Indian space technicians were also doing remarkable work, really impressive work. Some Indians were trained in the Soviet Union, particularly in technology, but some were also trained in Western countries. So I don't want to give the impression that the Soviet Union was alone in doing everything. Indians did have other exposures to other things, but Soviet Union, I think, was more willing to transfer technology, more willing to see India grow. We had one very big setback when, in the course of the détente between the Soviet Union and the West, the US, new control regimes were signed. For example, the missile technology control regime. The Americans objected when India was going to buy a cryogenic engine for their space satellites from the Soviet Union in the early 90s. So the Soviet Union, by then, early 90s, meant it was now Russia. And Russia stalled. It didn't give us the engine. And after a couple of years, they broke the contract saying force majeure. They were forced to do it. India then had to develop it indigenously. It took us a long time. It took us 22 years. From 1992, when we were trying to buy a Soviet engine, to 2014, when we made our own. We lost 2 decades. But I'm not blaming the Soviet Union or blaming Russia. They had also global issues in their minds. But I'm just saying, number one, not everything was given to us. They were not the only ones giving everything. But what they gave us, by and large, were things others were not giving. And they gave it to us in a spirit of goodwill and a willingness to transfer technology, for all of which we're grateful. But we also have to give credit to India's self-reliance, India's belief in the capacity of its own scientists and technologists, India's desire to be self-reliant. All of that also came up, and the Soviets helped us. But it's not that we were sort of just, replicating what the Soviets were doing. We had our own efforts as well.
Now, from the landmark S-400 air defense systems, these got highlighted during the India-Pakistan conflict, the recent one. Also, the BrahMos missile partnership. India-Russia defense ties, they've remained remarkably strong. In the current global scenario, how do you really see this relationship evolving?
Well, I think as long as Russia maintains its remarkable record in defense technology, it seems to me India will be in the market. The Indian military has a very simple policy. You identify a need, and then you buy the best in the world. It's not that you're going to go out and say, oh, we'll buy it because it's Soviet, or because it's Russian. It's not Soviet anymore, because it's Russian. And the Russians like us, and they'll give us their best. No. If the air defense system of some other country were better, we might have bought that. But our military concluded that the S-400 is the best air defense system. And so they insisted and they bought it from the... And you may remember there were threats of sanctions because it was around the time of the Ukraine war when Russia was being sanctioned. But we said we're going ahead because this is our protection, and it turned out to more than amply prove its worth against the Pakistani missiles. Similarly, there is no doubt that the extraordinary success of the BrahMos missile, which was used to devastating effect in the strikes against Pakistan on the 9th, 10th of May in Operation Sindoor, that is a very good example of joint technological development. This is Russian and Indian joint technology. They are both intellectual owners of the property. And the Bra comes from the Indian Brahma, and the Mos comes from Moscow. So it's very much a joint product.
And the two countries are now going to sell to third countries.
They're willing to sell to third countries because it's now considered a state-of-the-art missile. And in fact, it is said that both the Chinese and the Pakistanis were quite shocked by how effectively the BrahMos missile worked at that time. So my own view is where Russia is maintaining its high standards, it will always have a good market in India, and we see Russia as a trusted supplier. Where other countries might do better, I'm afraid one area, for example, is jet aircraft. There's now been a perception, as you know, that Western aircraft is better than the MiGs. And so we went for the Rafale last time from France, rather than either the American plane on offer or the Russian plane on offer. So our military is always going to try and choose the best available within our needs and our price constraints.
Also, Shashi, you mentioned sanctions a second ago. India has chosen to continue buy oil from Russia despite West trying to choke Russia's energy exports. Where do you stand now on that?
Look, we essentially tried to play a very maturely responsible game. We talked to the West about this, and we will not do it in a sanctions-busting kind of spirit. But we have a desperate need for energy in our country. We are 87% of our energy needs are imported. We don't produce enough oil and gas in our own country. In fact, we produce very minimal amounts in terms of our needs. Russia has this on offer. There are sanctions caps. That is, the price of Russian oil that can be sold is capped by the Western sanctions. It's not a UN sanction, but even then, that is something we have to adhere to. And we have also required the shipments of Russian oil and gas to be sanctions-compliant cargoes. So in other words, we are technically able to say to the West, we're not violating the sanctions. We're buying oil and gas, and we're doing it within the terms imposed by the sanctions. But frankly, we need the oil and gas. And I think in some ways, of course, Russia also needs a market, and we are a big market. But in some ways, we're still doing the West a favor. Because imagine, if we didn't buy so much Russian oil and gas, and all the other countries could not because of sanctions, that would take a large chunk out of the global market. We would then have to be competing for, say, oil and gas from the Middle Eastern Arab countries, from Venezuela and so on. So if there are more buyers for less oil, prices will have gone up. And then everybody in the world will be paying a higher price at the petrol pump. Buying Russian oil is taking that pressure off the oil prices. Now, oil prices are facing a number of other stresses, including the current tensions in the region. That's a different story. But as a result of the Ukraine war, I don't think India can be blamed. I might add one footnote. We're still buying less Russian oil than the Europeans are. And the Europeans are the ones imposing the sanctions.
After the recent 88-hour-long war between India and Pakistan, as you call it, Shashi, after Operation Sindoor was launched by...
It was never called a war because no war was declared.
Officially,
but an 88-hour exchange of hostilities, perhaps.
You were also part of the delegation. You were leading the delegation, rather, which really carried out India's message to the world. How do you think Russia or Russia's response to India was after Operation Sindoor?
Look, I think Russia definitely understood. I mean, first of all, when Pahalgam happened, the terrorist attack, which shocked the conscience of the world, Russia did make a public statement condemning the attack and standing in solidarity with India at that time. They did not make an explicit statement of support for Operation Sindoor, but our perception is there was some understanding for it, in the sense that the leaders of Russia, the president and the foreign minister, had both spoken to our prime minister and our foreign minister after Pahalgam, but before Sindoor, and they did not speak during Sindoor. But I would say that the understanding was there. My colleagues of the delegation that came here felt they had been given a good hearing and they were well received. One of the important things that we know Russia understands is that this is not just India versus Pakistan or anything like that. It is not about any particular bit of territory or any geopolitical dispute. It is about terrorism. It is about India versus terrorism. Russia has managed to conquer its own terrorism problem, but in the 90s, you remember the Chechen crisis and the bombs going off in Moscow and so on in the at the end of the last century and the beginning of this. So the Russians, I'm sure there are people old enough to remember how important the fight against terrorism was for Russia. It is equally important for us. And we want the Russian people to understand that for us, if there was no terrorism, we have no desire to go to war. We are a peace-loving nation. We are what Gandhi and Tolstoy were writing to each other about love and non-violence and ahimsa. But when we are struck, we will strike back. And it's as simple as that. And I think that message is being understood, that you can't, recite the usual bromides about peace and diplomacy and negotiation when one side is terrorists and the other side are innocent civilians on a holiday and are victims. When one country is providing territory, safe haven, arms, finance, and sending terrorists across the border, and the other country is exercising its right of self-defense. There is no equivalence. And as long as that is understood, what countries may or may not say publicly is secondary. What they say to us in terms of showing their understanding for our feelings, that's what matters.
What does the future hold for India-Russia relationship, Shashi, and how should it evolve in the changing world order?
The bilateral relationship, I think, is in good shape. It's evolved, obviously. India is not as dependent on the on the Russians as the old Soviet-style sort of launch pads that the Soviets gave us for a number of areas of key economic action. But as I said, for example, in defense, we're no longer talking about old technology. We're talking state-of-the-art, best technology. We're talking about willingness to transfer technology, to manufacture in India. All that kind of thing is very good. Economically, there's a lot of trade imbalance. We're exporting about $4.5 billion to Russia. Russia's exporting $65 billion to us. So Russia has got the better end of that deal, and economics will keep the partnership going. And the third thing I would say is that there is a comfort level. Russian tourists used to come to India in larger numbers. I hope that'll resume again in the post-COVID year. But before COVID, I remember my state of Kerala was overflowing with Russian tourists. Goa, overflowing with Russian tourists. So there's that kind of discovery of India from Russia that we hope will continue. And then from India's point of view, there's always been a fairly easy affinity. For example, ruble-rupee trade. I mean, the ruble and the rupee are roughly the same value. And a lot of trade was done between the two countries in local currencies. That kind of thing is a very, very major factor.
Dr. Shashi Tharoor, pleasure as always. Many thanks.
Lovely talking to you, Ranju. Thank you. India's rise was not made in isolation. It was forged in partnerships beyond the empire's shadows. The Soviets helped build steel plants, air force bases, space programs, and confidence. It's a story rarely told, but one that shows India's strength comes not from its past wounds, but from the synergies it shows to build its future.